Hi, Blake Rudis here, and today I'm going to give you your second bonus video towards the Zone System Masterclass. And as I've stated before, these videos are not included in the Zone System Masterclass, so if you would like to download these, you are more than welcome to, so that you can add these to the Zone System Masterclass when it's released next week. So what I want to talk about today is the importance of workflow. The Zone Systems Masterclass focuses so strongly on workflow that that's pretty much what it is. It's a very strong workflow-based course that's going to break down exactly when, where, and how to use all of the Zone System products, as well as these other things that maybe you do in your workflow, like using plugins and such. So before we get into that and how the Zone System Masterclass is going to work in your workflow, let's actually talk about workflow and talk about the importance of workflow, because it's really critical that you have a workflow. And if you don't have a workflow yet, it's really time to consider one. I'll tell you why. So workflow is nothing more than an organized series of steps used to create a photo. It's a series of steps that should flow efficiently so that you don't miss anything and make sure that you cover all the bases in your photo post-processing. And things that you should be considering are things like noise reduction, sharpening, curves adjustments, tone, color, white balance, all these things that you should be doing in every single one of your photos to make sure that you've covered all those bases. One of the biggest questions that I get asked by the readers of EverydayHDR is how do you develop a photographic workflow, and what is a workflow and why is it important? Or hey, can you show me your workflow? And the thing about workflow is that it's subjective to everybody, right? So your workflow is going to be different than my workflow. It's all subjective to who we are, how we think, and the programs that we use to create that workflow. But without a workflow, your work is going to suffer. Your photographs are going to suffer. Your art is going to suffer. Because without a workflow, you're just shooting in the dark. I remember how I was back in 2007. I'll even show you some of my first photos from 2007, 2009 era. And in that process, what I would do is I would go out on a shoot. I wasn't thinking about workflow while I was shooting. I was just thinking about taking a picture. And then when I got home, I wasn't thinking about what I was going to do to make that picture better. And I would get really upset. I'd get really frustrated and really upset that the picture that I took was nothing like the vision that was in my head. And a big part of that is because I didn't have a workflow. Let's take a look at some of these pictures from 2007, 2008, 2009 before I developed a workflow. So between the years of 2006 and 2011, I was living on the California coast, very close to it actually, in the Bay Area. I loved it there. And I really developed a passion for photography when I was on that coast. And that's pretty much where I started doing what I do now, my landscape stuff. The major problems that I had were that I wasn't thinking about workflow. I would take a picture and I would assume that the picture was all I needed, that I didn't need to do anything with it later. I was also shooting with a 9-megapixel camera in JPEG. So with this photograph, I can't do much rescuing with it. It's pretty much stuck where it is right now. And that's not a problem, it's still a decent photograph. But the thing is, when you think about workflow while you're shooting, and you think about the benefits of shooting in RAW versus something like JPEG, while you're on the scene, you start thinking about what you're going to do with it. You start thinking about, okay, the slow shutter speed, maybe take some HDR shots, maybe take multiple different exposures so that when I go back to my house and my computer, I'm not stuck with one exposure. And I wasn't thinking that way. And you can see that even in a photograph like this. It's the same thing. 9-megapixel camera, shot in JPEG. Not much I can do to rescue this photo. I wasn't really thinking about my workflow, and I really wasn't an HDR photographer at the time. This is 2007, it's the very beginning of my career. And some of the biggest things that I wish I could tell people now is that are just starting is really think about what you're going to do with the photograph after you get it. You can't just take a picture and say the picture is all that you need, because even back in the day when I was shooting in film, we still would go into our darkroom to pull out some beautiful stuff in our photographs. The same thing happens with digital today. Nicely composed here, I can maybe do some clone stamping with this photograph to get all the stuff out of the way. But again, I wasn't very good back then. I'm pulling these images straight from my archive, not editing them, to show you kind of where I started and where I was without a workflow. Here's another one, another 2007 image. Again, things aren't that bad. Obviously, my bubble level in my head is broken. Every one of my photographs is off by about 2 degrees. It just, even if I'm on a tripod and I have the level on there, I still cannot get a good shot. So you can see that I was probably using some filter stuff at this point. I'm just getting a little bit more advanced with some of my techniques, but still wasn't thinking about workflow. I was thinking maybe if I just put a filter on my lens that it'll make everything better. Well, that could happen, but there's also more that you need to do. So again, nicely composed, maybe could be cropped a little bit to, satisfy the whole rule of thirds idea or the whole rule of thirds concept, but it's working there. It's getting on a path. Here we go, and we transition to 2008, where things are starting to get a little bit better. Not shooting in RAW yet. Still, I didn't shoot in RAW till 2010. And you can see there's a dramatic difference in my photographs when I started shooting in RAW because of that thought of using workflow later. But I would take a picture, think that that's all I needed. I'd go home, I'd load it to my computer, and I'd be really dissatisfied because I didn't know what to do. If I brought it into Photoshop, I would modify a curves adjustment, maybe open up the levels or adjust the exposure, but I didn't really know how to mask. I didn't understand my software. So because I didn't understand my software, I couldn't develop a good workflow. Here we go, still transitioning into 2008, one of my later photos in 2008. Now you can see that I'm starting to think about what happens afterwards. In this photograph, I know I actually did use a curves adjustment layer just for the rocks. So I was thinking while I was on the scene, okay, I do want this to be a long exposure. I want that long wispy type water, but I also need to be able to recover something in the foreground. So I started thinking about workflow and what I was going to do with the photograph while I was on scene, and things are dramatically getting better from the very beginning of where I was in something like 2007. Now, I started shooting film in 1999, so I do have quite a bit of experience with photography. So in that 2007 to 2010 range, I was really just trying to hone my skills on the back end, not necessarily on the composition side, but more on the what do you do with a digital photograph, because I was from the film world, only knowing what to do with film. So here's 2009, where I'm transitioning even more, getting a little bit better, and really starting to think more about what happens afterwards. I know for a fact with this photograph that I did some saturation adjustments, some curves adjustments, some levels. I did some selective masking. A lot more creative stuff started to go into this, which is a dramatic difference from where I started back in 2007 with that first photograph that we saw. And then going into 2010, this is where I started doing HDR. Now, you might think, oh, this is a very vivid HDR photograph, Blake, and you're right. But we learn from our mistakes. So with this, I did a very high, hyper detailed HDR photograph. I was really in the experimentation process. There's nothing wrong with that. Workflow is experimentation. You have to experiment to get the workflow that works for you. So here's where I started experimenting with HDR photography and some of my coastline scenes. And things started to take a dramatic turn in 2010. Shortly after I shot this photograph, I actually started shooting in RAW also. So things started to get much better. So thinking about the HDR process, and a lot of people shy away from HDR, but what HDR does is HDR opens up a world of difference for you, and that's specifically in your workflow, because you have to think, okay, I need this many exposures, I need to bracket these exposures, I need a light exposure, I need a dark exposure, and then when I go into Photomatics, I need to make sure they don't push things too far, or if I'm in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw merging my HDR, I can't push things too far, I've got to keep them nice and stable. There's all kinds of things that happen when you're using the HDR process. That's why I would always tell everyone, just experiment with HDR. You're going to be dramatically surprised by how well your photographs are going to increase when you're using the HDR process in your workflow, because it forces you to do things that are out of your comfort zone. So at this point, we've talked about what workflow is, and we've talked about what my work looked like without a workflow. So now let's look at how I started to develop that workflow. And the first thing I want to cover are the barriers to a workflow. One of the biggest barriers of workflow is having too much. This one happens all the time too. I get a lot of individuals saying, hey, I've got Topaz software on one, Adobe Camera Raw, Photoshop Elements, PaintShop Pro. How do I develop a workflow with all of those? And that's a chaotic nightmare to answer. So barriers to workflow, you can have too much. I mean, let's take a look at just a couple of Topaz, On One, Photomatics, Photoshop, Lightroom, Adobe Camera Raw, Alonio, Nik, HDR Effects Pro, TIFF and DFX, Photoshop Elements, PaintShop Pro, GIMP, DxO Optics. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. All these things that you can use to create your images. you can have too much. So one of the ways that you overcome that is you have to look at each one of those individual programs that you have, and you have to categorize them. This is what I've done to create my workflows. I've said, okay, these are the 4 parts to the workflow. The preliminary phase, that's taking the pictures and then maybe moving into Photomatics for me. The pre-processing phase, that's where I'm using Adobe Camera Raw, or maybe you use Lightroom or maybe some plugins to do that kind of stuff. The post-processing phase, that's where I jump into Photoshop and I adjust tone and color and do all of my clone stamping and noise reduction, sharpening, that kind of thing. And then the creative processing. Creative processing, that's where doors are open, and that's where plugins really come in handy. But the thing that you need to do in order to develop that 4-step type of workflow is see where each one of those individual plugins that you have is going to fit into there. To do that, you really have to look at each one of those individual plugins for what they are. Some people might work really well with Lightroom, whereas for me, you know that I use Adobe Camera Raw. I love Adobe Camera Raw because it plugs right into Photoshop, it's really easy and it works. But my brain is wired that way. It's all about how your brain is wired and which programs are going to be wired best to your brain. So what you have to do first, before you can take those plugins and those programs and put them into your categories of where they're going to fit in your workflow, you have to see how they're going to map with your brain, how they're going to match up with you. Some of these plugins and some of these programs I just can't work with. And you might be in that same boat where you see a tutorial that someone's done something really amazing with the Topaz product, but every time you go into it, it doesn't happen that way. Well, that might be because it's not wired to your brain. Maybe there's a serious communication mismatch between you and that plugin, and you may never be able to use it, and that's fine. But does that mean you still need to figure out how to fit it into your workflow? No, not at all. Maybe you don't need that program at all in your workflow. I'll tell you that for me to make my workflow successful, there are really only 3 things that I absolutely positively need. 1, Photomatics. 2, Adobe Camera Raw. And 3, Photoshop. Do I use other stuff? Yes, I use other stuff in my workflow. But they're usually for very specific things because I figured out which ones wired with my brain will work in my workflow. So it's really critical that you lay out how the workflow is going to be for you. Preliminary, pre-processing, post-processing, creative post-processing. Those are the 4 things that you really need to do. One of the best things that you can do for yourself right now is to take these categories, the preliminary process, the pre-processing, the post-processing, and the creative post-processing. Start adjusting your plugins and the software that you own and seeing where they fit into those categories for you. So what you need to do right now is download this video with the PDF document that's included. It's going to have the preliminary process, the pre-processing, the post-processing, the creative post-processing spelled out and with little blanks next to them so that you can put the programs that you own in each one of those individual spots. That'll start to help you develop a workflow and overcome having too much. All right? What you're going to notice though is that there's some serious benefits to having a workflow. Number 1, you're going to be doing some more non-destructive editing, which means everything that you're doing in the process, when you have a streamlined, efficient process, you're going to cut down on the amount of destructive editing that you're doing to your photographs. So you're no longer going to be saving things to your photographs that are permanent adjustments. You'll be doing things to those photographs that you can edit later so that you don't have to worry too much about destroying the photos that you're working on. You're going to be doing some more intuitive editing. Number 2, definitely more intuitive editing. When you start to put things in a process and you spell them out and you say, okay, I'm going to do this first, this second, this third, this fourth, it's intuitive editing because you're not going to skip a step, or you're not going to do a step where it doesn't belong. You may not sharpen in the beginning before doing noise reduction. Those 2 things you definitely want to keep in a process. Noise reduction somewhere in the beginning and your sharpening somewhere in the middle or end. Number 3, you are going to have better end results. I can guarantee you that. I'm going to show you some pictures coming up here. And these pictures are after I developed a workflow. What happened to my images after I started doing things in a series of steps, concise steps that were very intuitively laid out. Everything started to get better. I started to actually shoot for my workflow. So I knew going into it exactly what I was going to shoot, how I was going to shoot it, and what the end result would be before I was even at that end result. It was absolutely incredible. My work got so much better just by developing that workflow and thinking about the workflow even while I was shooting, not necessarily while I'm post-processing. 4, you're actually going to start to develop an idea of when enough is enough. Another big question I get is, okay, I've got all this stuff, I've done all this editing, how do I know that I've done enough? When is enough enough? How do you know when to just stop editing your photo? And the biggest response I have to that is, you just know. But in reality, if you have a workflow, if you have a series of steps and you've checked every box is checked, maybe that's when enough is enough. So we've talked about all these benefits of workflow, we've talked about how to develop a workflow, but let's just look at some images that have benefited from having a workflow. This image was taken in late 2010 after I really started to understand the whole HDR process and what needed to happen after the photo was taken and after I ran it through Photomatix. So in this specific photograph, I started using the preliminary phase, the pre-processing phase, the post-processing phase, and then getting into the creative processing phase. All of that stuff, all the stuff that we just talked about happened in this photograph to make this photograph one of my most epic photographs I've ever taken. It's the Bixby Canyon Bridge on Highway 1 in California. Amazing place to shoot if you ever get the chance to do it. Here's another photograph. This one I had to think extra hard because it's a long exposure mixed with an HDR. So there's a lot of stuff that you have to think about while you're on the scene in order to say, okay, here I need to get one good long exposure photograph with a 10-stop ND filter, but I also need some of those HDR images so I can get some really great detail out of this photograph that I couldn't get in a long exposure. So all those things you have to be thinking about while you're on scene for your workflow later. Here's another one, same thing. Long exposure mixed with some HDR, one of my favorite photographs I've ever taken. It's all because I developed a good workflow. If you would have seen this image before I did anything to it, it was nothing special. But the workflow that happened, all of those parts, the preliminary phase, making sure I had everything that I needed while I was on the scene, the pre-processing phase, making sure that those were perfect in Adobe Camera Raw before going into tone and color in Photoshop. And then into the creative post-processing phase after the post-processing, where I started to color grade this photo and really take it to that next level. Here's another one. See, there's a unification happening here. Another long exposure mixed with HDR. It's a great workflow, but if you don't have it nailed down in your head and you don't have a process for it, it's never going to work for you. So you really have to be taking this workflow issue seriously and develop that workflow if you want your work to develop for you. So we've talked about a lot of things here. We've covered a lot of territory. We talked about what workflow is, how important it is to have that workflow, that series of concise steps to get you onto the better end result. We talked about what happens if you don't have a workflow, and I even showed you some of my images that I had before I even came anywhere near having a workflow. And just, they weren't bad, but they weren't as good as they could have been. And a big problem was because I was shooting in JPEG. I was shooting in JPEG because I wasn't thinking about what happened after. I was only thinking about shooting then. And when you shoot in RAW, you're already thinking about your workflow because you have the ability to do a lot more editing than JPEG. We talked about those barriers to workflow. One of the biggest barriers to workflow is having too much stuff and not knowing where to place it in your personal workflow. We also talked about how to overcome that, how to overcome having too much stuff by creating that concise workflow and knowing that maybe some plugins just aren't wired for you. Maybe you don't work well with Topaz denoise because it just doesn't match your brain function very well, and that's perfectly fine. Not everything is designed for every single person. In overcoming that barrier to having too much, we discussed the 4 steps: the preliminary phase, the pre-processing phase, the post-processing phase, and the creative processing phase. So make sure you download that PDF and start placing your plugins where they belong on that path. And then we talked about the benefits of a workflow and just how important it is to have a workflow because of what it's going to do for you and your art in the end. And I want to stress that my workflow is going to be different than your workflow. All I can give you are suggestions on how workflow works for me, but you're going to have to develop your own workflow. And when you develop your own workflow, you're going to develop your own photographic style, and that's the most exciting part. I'm extremely excited for the release of the Zone Systems Masterclass. I've been working on this course nonstop for the last 4 months, developing the perfect workflow with the Zone systems. So I'm really excited to share that with you because it is very workflow based. You're going to see that it's about 4 hours of workflow intensive training. This is the best of the best as I've seen it so far from my courses, and I'm really excited to share it with you. So like I said before, download this course so you can add it to your Zone Systems Masterclass, and also download the PDF that goes with this so that you can start developing your workflow and seeing where your workflow fits in before you see the Zone Systems Masterclass. Again, I'm Blake Rudis, and thank you very much for watching this. I really appreciate your continual support.